Hello, welcome to our Sunday school time at Temple Baptist Church. We're honored that you have joined us today. We are still in the book of Genesis, studying that. In fact, we've got two more lessons this quarter, but next quarter we're going to look at this next part of Genesis. So we're going to be in Genesis for a while. If you haven't got new literature yet for the upcoming new quarter, let us come by here and we'll see that you get some literature so you can follow along with us. The title of the lesson today is Established. We're in Genesis chapter 17. We got verses 1 through 10 and then 15 through 19. And it's kind of hard to think about, but I guess we do need memory verses. And let's see if I can find it right quick what our memory verse is for today. And I don't have it memorized, so it's obviously not a good memory verse, or I didn't do a very good job of memorizing it, but it's in Genesis chapter 17 and verse 7, and it says this right here, "And I will establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seeds after thee in their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee and to thy seeds after thee." So we're really going to be talking about, it's established as the name of the lesson, but we're really going to be talking about the covenant that God made with Abram, and then changed his name to Abraham. And I don't know whether you've ever looked at your life and maybe tried to look at the high points and the low points of that, but as we study the life of Abram, and now in today's lesson, God's going to change his name to Abraham. Genesis 17 may well be the high mark of his life. And at the high point in Genesis, for that matter, it may be the high point. Here God is reaffirming this covenant relationship with Abraham and announces that Abraham's been waiting for this promise to be established, this covenant to be established, and it's almost over. Before long, he would have a son with his wife Sarai, and they're going to change that name too. They both to me sound just alike, but nevertheless they're new, and and God is using a name for himself that he has never used before. It's El Shaddai, which speaks of God as the all-powerful and all-sufficient one. We already know that as God's children. We already know that. But and so as we look at this study today, and we see things about it and what God is trying to teach us, and the introduction, we always have a brief introduction in your study book, and even in the teacher's guide we have a introduction. And wedding ceremonies typically include the making of vows. Couples declare that their commitment to each other, saying "I do," and we know that God established marriage way back then. It's a commitment before God of a man and woman to one another, and I want to emphasize that, man and woman to one another. But because God is eternal and faithful, his covenant with believers is everlasting. A covenant between a man and a woman in marriage is supposed to be until death do us part. Sad to say today it's very likely not that way too much anymore, but it just, it's the world we live in today and the way people take things. I think that's enough on that. But just understanding our context a little bit today, Genesis chapter 17 sets the timeline for the story. By this time, Abram, I'll call him Abraham, I'll call him Abram, I'll use both of them, and either one will fit, but after this he should be called Abraham, and so before that he's not. But it's been 24 years, nearly a quarter of a century has passed from the scene since God first promised him the land and a son from whom the nations would descend. And so, and Abram and Sarah, they have tried to help God. A lot of times we've done that, haven't we? We've tried to help God. God, you're just a little too slow on this. We need to speed things up. And, Abram suggested making Eleazar, his servant, his heir. And then Sarai conceived a scheme to raise a line through her servant Hagar. And God rejected both attempts, didn't he? Because he had a better plan. God always does have a better plan for us. I need today to remember that as we go through life. And so in Genesis chapter 17 here, God spoke to Abram to reaffirm the covenant that he's made. And, there is a big word here that I'm going to use, and I hope I pronounce it right, a theophany. And that is a physical appearance or a personal manifestation of God to human beings. And these occurrences were all time through the Old Testament, angels and the Lord, and even in the burning bush with Moses and things like that. We're talking about a covenant relationship here. One characteristic of a covenant between God and Abram is that it was an everlasting or permanent covenant. Now, I can go back again. I'm going to go back to the marriage thing. That is permanent until death do us part. And so God, he's already he's giving some specific instructions to Abram and his descendants concerning their part, their side of it. God's got his part. Their side of it is circumcision. And circumcision indicates that Abraham and his descendants were in a covenant relationship with God. It marked membership in the covenant community. So, and I think there's a couple of more important things that are recorded in chapter 17 here. First, Abram's name, which means exalted father, is now changed to Abraham, which means father of many. And Sarai's name was also changed to Sarah, which both names generally mean princess. And you can ask why they changed this and all that, but her previous homeland was Uriah, and the language of Canaan, the promised land. So maybe a difference in the language there, and and it also includes in chapter 17. It also includes God's promise that a great nation would come through Ishmael. God's not going to forget Ishmael, Abraham's son, through Hagar, and this was in response to Abraham pleading to God for to blessing on Ishmael. And Ishmael was not the child of promise, but God graciously honors Abraham's request. And so, and then we're not going to get into Genesis 18, but if you know the story of that, Abram is visited by three men, and so we know what goes on there, and the promised birth of Isaac to Sarah, and the Lord was not the one speaking to Abraham directly. But let's just think a little bit about this covenant. We don't use the word covenant very much anymore, I don't think. We probably use the term contract more than anything else. A covenant is an agreement of binding promises between two parties, with each party being responsible to hold up their end of the agreement. Again, marriage, that's a covenant, a contract, we might say. If you have a home loan, if your home is financed today, that's really a covenant. We call it a contract today, but the lender has agreed to loan you so much money to buy this house, and you have agreed to pay so much money in return and interest. Even a car loan could be considered a covenant. Even credit cards could be considered a covenant. So, when we think about, we change things today. We want to call it a home loan. We want to call it an auto loan. We want to call it a credit card, and we have a certain amount of credit on that we can use, and as long as we pay it back, as long as we make those payments, everything, that's our part. The lender has done their part, and God has done his part, is doing his part with Abram, and again, he's going to start calling him Abraham, and so we understand that. And so let's just get into our text here. We'll right quickly see what we can get through here. And when Abram was 90 years old and 9, the Lord appeared to Abram and said unto him, I am the Almighty God. Walk before me, and be thou perfect, and I will make my covenant between me and thee, and will multiply thy seeds exceedingly. And Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be the father of many nations. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be called Abraham. For a father of many nations have I made thee. And I will make thee exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. And I will establish my covenant between me and thee, and thy seeds after thee, in their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee, and to thy seeds after thee. And I will give unto thee, and to thy seeds after thee, the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession. I will be their God. Now, this is actually, I think, about the 5th time that God has appeared to Abraham, and this appearance occurs after 13 years of silence. It's been 13 years since God has appeared to Abraham, and so this is, you take whoever you want to is talking to Abraham, but it's God confirmed. And when the key phrase here to me is Almighty God. God begins his affirmation of this contract, identifying the parties involved in the contract. In the Hebrew word, it is El Shaddai. And I think this is the first time that God uses the name of himself in Genesis. It refers to his all-powerful and all-sufficient characters. He needs no one outside of himself. He doesn't need anyone outside himself. He can do anything and meet all needs. He can do it all. This will be the name that God uses, as the patriarchs go forward. Walk before me, and be thou perfect. Well, let's don't get that word perfect too far out of line. Walking in God's presence involves a constant awareness that his presence and watching, and such an awareness leads to the conduct that honors God. And to be perfect doesn't mean to be sinless. It does not mean that. None of us are perfect in that respect. Rather, it refers to a single-hearted devotion to God, sincere in all areas of life. Give our best to God is what that means too. A covenant, and again, a covenant is agreement between two parties, with each one being responsible. The word, they say, and I didn't count this, the word is used 13 times in this chapter. God describes this as my covenant, and he mentions 4 features of it. His agreement with Abraham, God would make Abram the father of many nations. He would make Abram fruitful. This was a permanent covenant. Abram's descendants would possess Canaan. And so, here's the covenant. Here's God's part of it. And we know that God is faithful to do that. And now at this point, Abram's name is changed to Abraham. And I think identified as Abram was identified as the exalted father, but now to the father of many nations. Names in that time were very significant, and maybe still are in the Middle East and all of that. And I want you to go back, if you will, and notice the number of times that I will appears in Genesis 17 and verses 1 through 18. I marked the ones that I caught right off the bat. In verse 2, he said, I will make a covenant. And then he says, I will make thee exceedingly fruitful. I will make nations of thee. I will establish my covenant. I will give. I will be their God. There's God. He's there. I'm there. An everlasting covenant. The covenant that I talk about some covenants other than marriage, a home loan that expires. After a certain number of years, you get that paid. And, everlasting possession, the covenant, it's not the relationship between God and the offsprings Abraham, it also dealt with the land of promise, Canaan. He's giving them all of this. The ability to stay in the land depended on their obedience and loyalty to the Lord. And we know punishment resulted because of idolatry, causing some of them to go into exile. And so we're quite aware of all of that. And so as we continue in Genesis chapter 17, let's look at verses 9 and 10. God said unto Abraham, Thou shalt keep my covenant, therefore, thou and thy seeds after thee in their generations. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and thy seeds after thee. Every man child among you shall be circumcised. All right, here comes, we've got God's part, the requirements, thou and thy seeds, the honor God. Every male child was going to be circumcised after they were 8 days old, and Abram goes back and he does this. He circumcises all the males that are there, even Ishmael, and doesn't make him a part of it. But and God said, "You shall." This is again our responsibility, or Abram's responsibility, Abraham's responsibility, uphold the part of the covenant which, living before God and remaining blameless, the obedience and loyalty to the Lord would be demonstrated physically through circumcision. And the act of circumcision, of course, did not make them a member of the covenant community. Rather, it was a sign of their membership. And we're not going to talk a whole lot about that. Now, in the New Testament times, we had some, they have some discussion about that. Under the law, they still thought that in order to be saved, you had to be circumcised and be a child of Abraham and all of that. And, it's just a badge to Abraham's descendants. Circumcision was a sign or a badge of the covenant. And, so we look at that, we think about that a little bit, and we just look at everything that God has done. And then God said unto Abraham, verse 15 through 19, As for Sarai, thy wife, thou shalt call her name Sarah, shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. And I will bless her, and give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations, kings of people shall be of her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, Shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old, and Sarah that is 90 years old bear? And Abraham said unto God, O that Ishmael may live before thee. And God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant with his seeds after him. So basically what we got here, you're going to call, you're no longer going to call her Sarai, you can call her Sarah. That when they both mean princess, and just to get a change maybe in the language and the area in which they lived, and also of her. This is the first, I guess maybe specific mention that the son promised to Abraham is going to come through his wife Sarah. It's not going to come through these things that you've tried to do. It's going to come through. It's going to come through there. And and God told Abraham the child would be born according to the time of life. You go to Genesis chapter 18. When I said we're not going to cover that in this quarter study, but we can look at it and think about it again. God promised a blessing on Sarah. Normally the blessing was pronounced on the male ancestor of the offspring to come. But no, and Abraham falls upon his face. This is the same reaction we see in verse 3. Fall on one's face meant to kneel with one's hands spread out and the forehead touching the ground. That's a genuine way of expressing humility and utmost reverence. No doubt Abraham was filled with wonder and gratitude, and so laughed. We think about that. Much laughter was associated with the birth of Isaac, wasn't it? Whose name was means laughter. Here Abraham laughed, maybe with joy of the prospect of a son being born to Sarah. and him at such an advanced age. Here they are, they're well beyond what we call the age of childbearing. And, she laughed at the news that she would be pregnant at 89 years of age. And in Genesis chapter 18 and 13, God calls Abraham's attention to Sarah's laughter, announces that nothing was too hard for God to accomplish. Yeah, for a man to accomplish, for a nature to accomplish, it's hard, but God, just didn't do it. And we think about Sarah laughing here a little bit. It probably had a little bit element of doubt, but she also had great joy. And that Ishmael may live before thee. There's no doubt that Abraham loved him. He's had him around for 13 years. He grew fond of him, and so he needs that. And in verse 19, indeed, in the original Hebrew word, the word is an aberrat that carries the force of an injunction. It also means truly. In this context, it means God was strongly rejecting Abraham's suggestion that Ishmael, as the son of the promise, and emphasize that Isaac is the one, the son of Sarah, stepping into the role. He's the one that's going to do it. And he said, I'm going to establish my covenant with thee. God responded to Abraham's request by acknowledging that his prayers had been heard. God promised to give Ishmael a prominent future and build a great people from him. Want to look at the family tree of Ishmael? You go to Genesis chapter 25 and 12 through 18, and you'll get all of that. And as we think about this, as we get ready to close on this lesson, we have to recognize, as believers, we should recognize God's grace in his dealing with us. He is gracious to us. As believers, we are to demonstrate our faith in Jesus. And believers should trust God to accomplish what only he can accomplish. I go back to what Isaac or Abraham and Sarah tried to do because they didn't think God was fulfilling this plan quick enough. They interceded. They tried to do things, but we cannot do that. It's God's timing. God alone can do those things. We appreciate you joining us today in our study, and we pray that we've said something to you today that will uplift your heart and renew a covenant relationship you have with God. It's an everlasting relationship. It never ends. May God bless you is our prayer.